8. Causes of the 1885 struggle. The term Riel Rebellion for the hostilities of 1885 is not only misleading but incorrect, because it implies that Louis Riel alone was responsible for the hostilities. The truth is that he entered only the later stages of a long struggle involving many groups in the Northwest. The War of 1885 was the culmination of a complex struggle that had arisen over the previous 2 decades between the people of the Northwest and the industrial rulers of Ottawa. Western protests were made by local merchants, farmers, settlers, workers, Indians, and Métis, and their demands essentially centered around the need for responsible government to make economic and land reforms. The hostilities of 1885 proved to be an important turning point in the social and political development of Canada. The new rulers established capitalism in the Northwest, and the way was clear for modern agriculture and industrialism to expand through the private enterprise system. Although responsible government had been granted to the small province of Manitoba in 1870, including the authority necessary for provincial administration, the federal government had not imposed its constitutional authority on the remainder of the Northwest. The territories in 1870 were wholly without government of any form. The institutions of law and order, as understood in civilized communities, were non-existent. Nominal control remained solely in the hands of the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba until 1873, when the Governor-General of Canada appointed a council to help him. The council and the new Lieutenant Governor, Alexander Morris, urged the government to create a police force, the NWMP, which they did in 1873. Control of Indian affairs and of the NWMP was retained by Ottawa at this time, and has never been relinquished. Finally, the Northwest Territories Act of 1875 reorganized the Northwest Council and named a Lieutenant Governor exclusively for the Northwest Territories, whose population of about 20,000 at the time included 13,000 Indians, 5,000 Métis, and 2,000 whites. The appointed council of 5 members and a lieutenant governor had the power to pass ordinances relating to taxation for local purposes, public health, highways, and the administration of justice. However, they did not have a judicial system or a police force of their own capable of carrying out these functions. Ottawa reserved the right to disallow any ordinances passed by the Northwest Council. This pseudo-federal administration was imposed on the Northwest people without their participation and had no connection to their local political development. But, since federal troops did not move beyond Manitoba after the Civil War, the Northwest people were able to establish a certain degree of local autonomy. As early as 1873, there was already considerable regional interest and involvement in local political affairs. Unlike the Indians, some Métis were still relatively independent within their communities, and their native councils acted as their local government. At St. Lawrence, Saskatchewan, for instance, the Métis population of approximately 800 people became highly organized and very involved in local politics. By 1875, the Métis of St. Laurent had established their own local government, including a 5-member council and a president. Apart from the injustices suffered by the Indians and Métis, discontent among all people in the Northwest, both native and white, began in the early 1880s, mainly centering around economic issues. The cost of machinery was 40% higher on the prairies than in the east. Local wholesale merchants charged a high price for all goods, regardless of whether they were imported or not, while farmers received low prices for their products. Freighting companies like the Hudson's Bay imposed excessively high transportation rates. Many farmers who were forced to live on credit were charged high interest and fell increasingly into debt. By 1884, the economic crisis was at its worst. The Northwest land boom had collapsed. CPR construction had almost come to a standstill because the federal treasury was empty, and immigration to the prairies slowed to a trickle as prices for Western goods dropped seriously. Moreover, the increasingly authoritarian leadership of Lieutenant Governor Dewdney discouraged local participation in the political and economic concerns of the community. The people felt themselves to be voiceless victims in a corrupt system. Discontent accelerated, with the center of agitation at Prince Albert, where many land investors had lost large sums of money in 1882 when the CPR route was diverted from Prince Albert to Regina. Throughout the Northwest, the generous grants of land given to the CPR by the federal government angered the people. For example, in one transaction, 17 million acres were given to the CPR, even though some of the woodlots in that area had been promised to settlers. These injustices were perpetuated without warning or consultation with residents of the area, leaving many embittered and hostile. Supporting the Northwest struggle were many different groups. Farmers and Métis felt a bond of mutual oppression and wanted a redress of their shared grievances. Following the recession in the West in 1882, white settlers began to petition for better conditions, but although they presented their demands to the Macdonald administration on frequent occasions, Their requests were ignored each time, and they became increasingly aggravated. People at a mass meeting in Prince Albert dealing with the sale of local land to the CPR stated, "Another sale is shortly to be held, when we may expect just such another outburst of popular feeling. In some parts the settlers threaten bloodshed rather than ejectment, and should it come to this, the Dominion government will be powerless to enforce the law, as neither mounted police nor Canadian volunteers will be willing to engage in the work of driving Canadians from their rightful homes in order that the land grabbers may have quiet possession thereof." A typical conflict over the construction of a telegraph line between Humboldt and Prince Albert. A small group of local businessmen favored by Ottawa received the contract. When the official town committee selected a route contrary to the one chosen by these businessmen and had the poles moved to another location, a member of the group became exceedingly angry. He charged the men who removed the poles with unlawfully and maliciously removing property of the Dominion government. But when the 6 defendants appeared in court, they were accompanied by 300 local supporters, many of them armed. The case was immediately adjourned by the presiding judge, and the town remained in a state of near riot for 10 days. On 15th November 1883, when the 6 accused reappeared in court, the judge quietly dismissed charges because police reinforcements had not arrived to quell the disturbances. Feelings of resentment toward these prominent businessmen and the Hudson's Bay Company had been festering for some time. A militant mood was revealed as early as April, when rumors were heard of a bizarre plot to seize the Dominion Lands office in Prince Albert and hold Governor Dewdney as hostage until every settler got his patent. White settlers became insistent in their demands for responsible government through the Northwest Territories, not just in the Saskatchewan area. Settlers throughout the Northwest made 4 basic demands of the Ottawa authorities. First, lower the tariff rates. Second, cancel the CPR monopoly at once. Third, give provincial status to the Northwest. And finally, construct the railway to the Hudson Bay. In Manitoba, general labor strikes and expressions of protests warned of serious trouble. However, the major weakness of the Northwest People's confrontation was a lack of effective leadership above the local level that could provide systematic organization of the various groups into one integrated force. Emerging from the local white population and shaping the direction of the agitation was William Henry Jackson, a white farmer who was a liberal militant and an effective spokesman. He became one of the major leaders of the white settlers and worked closely with the Native Peoples Movement. Together with Charles Adams, president of the English Half-Breeds Association, Thomas Scott, a white farmer, and others, Jackson helped organize the settlers and farmers unions throughout the Northwest. Operating at the local level, these groups arranged for the election of delegates to a central committee, which became the governing body of confrontation activities. In the spring of 1884, a delegation of 3, including Gabriel Dumont, was sent to fetch Riel from the United States, where he had lived in exile since 1873. MacDonald now had someone to blame personally for the agitation. If shooting began, the Métis would be the victims, and Riel was a made-to-order scapegoat. Propaganda was circulated that described Riel as an advocate of hostilities and a leader of the poor, ignorant Métis, who would do what he commanded. Finally, MacDonald began to show a personal interest in the Western political scene, although he still pleaded ignorance of Métis grievances. A month after Louis' arrival, Sir John sent a couple of observers to Saskatchewan and informed the Governor-General of Canada that he was watching the situation. The Prime Minister had taken steps to make sure that his opinions of the Northwest Troubles would be circulated to the local people by assuming financial control over the Prince Albert Times newspaper. On 18th July 1884, he wrote to Lieutenant Governor Dewdney, "I forget whether I told you that I had arranged to secure the Prince Albert paper, so if any little patronage can be sent them from below, it will be appreciated." Thus, in control of the only Prince Albert communications medium, the MacDonald regime began its task of putting out propaganda against the white settlers movement. Exaggerations of potential Indian and Métis uprisings were headlined and used to justify the recruiting of police in the area. The presence of a greater number of soldiers and police intimidated the people and threatened the militant leaders. By the summer of 1884, the Métis and Indians were becoming isolated from the white people's organizations and forces. The leaders realized that some sort of scheme seemed to be working against the whole Northwest People's Movement, but they became more determined to resist whatever action Ottawa might launch. A manifesto was issued through the Central Committee's secretary, William Jackson, on 28th July 1884. which outlined their intentions and actions and pointed out the need to keep all groups working together. To the citizens of Prince Albert, gentlemen, we are starting a movement in the settlement with a view to attaining provincial legislatures for the Northwest Territories and, if possible, the control of our own resources, that we may build our railroads and other works to serve our own interests rather than those of the eastern provinces. We are preparing a statement of our cause to send to Ottawa as a matter of form. We state the various evils which are caused by the present system of legislation, showing 1. That they are caused by the facts that Ottawa legislatures are responsible to eastern constituents, not to us, and are therefore impelled to legislate with a view to eastern interests rather than our own, that they are not actually resident in the country, and therefore not acquainted with the facts that would enable them to form a correct opinion as to what measures are suitable to Northwest interests, consequently liable to pass legislation averse to Northwest interests, even when not favorable to their own. Lastly, that they have not the greater part of their immediate private interests involved in the interest of the said territories, and are therefore liable to have their judgment warped by such private interests. 2. That the legislation passed by such legislators has already produced great depression in agricultural, commercial, and mechanical circles, and will continue to increase the depression unless the system is revised. That is to say, unless our legislators are chosen by and responsible to ourselves, actually resident in the country, and having the bulk of their private interests involved in the interests of the country. We give the complete list of our grievances, but instead of asking the redress of each of them separately, we ask the remedy to the root of the evil, i.e. provincial legislatures, with full control over our own resources and internal administration, and power to send a just number of representatives to the federal legislature, whatever and wherever they may ultimately lie. Possibly we may settle up with the East and form a separate federation of our own in direct connection with the Crown. Louis Riel of Manitoba fame has united the half-breed element solidly in our favor. Hitherto, it has been used by whatever party happened to be in power in the East, but Riel has warned them against the dangers of being separated from the whites by party proposals. Throughout the summers of 1884, settlers and farmers' unions organized and agitated for their cause. Representatives from Qu'Appelle and Assiniboia visited Ottawa to make their demands heard, and the people of the Northwest were clearly prepared politically for organized confrontation with the federal government. They talked as well of secession from Canada and possible annexation to the United States. There was certainly a large number of people in the Northwest Territories who were prepared for annexation, and all that summer more people joined them. It was a political necessity for Macdonald's government to hold on to the Northwest, since Western settlement and the Trans-Canada CPR were part of the Conservative Party's promise. The federal government also knew that they had to crush the secession movement and the Northwest agitational forces in order not to lose this valuable land and its resources. The plan constructed by the federal authorities was that they can make certain concessions to the white residents of the Northwest, while at the same time allowing the Métis and Indian situation to aggravate itself to the point of desperation and hostility. In this way, Ottawa could justify troop movements to the Northwest by saying that savages had created an uprising and were massacring innocent settlers. Military occupation of the troubled Northwest in the eyes of the whites of Eastern Canada would be not only an urgent necessity, but an act of justice on behalf of all Canadians, and Macdonald would be hailed as a hero. At the Northwest Farmers Union Convention, held in Winnipeg in early January 1885, a Declaration of Rights was drawn up. Basically, it condemned the oppressive duty on agricultural implements, the monopolistic operation of the CPR, and the vexatious methods in the administration of public lands. The members denounced the federal government for its deceitful practices in luring immigrants to the West as the promised land, when in fact they had experienced only hardships and failure. The farmers complained that the price of grain was so low that it did not allow even a subsistence living. They claimed that agriculture had been in a fair state a few years earlier, but that lately the lands were deserted and overgrown with weeds, and the buildings were fast decaying. Their declaration demanded the right to autonomous local government, provincial control of railways and public lands, the removal of custom duties on farm machinery and building materials, representation in the Dominion Cabinet, and the construction of a Hudson's Bay Railway. They wanted greater authority for the Northwest Territories Council. They insisted that the council members should be elected by local residents rather than appointed by friends of John A. Macdonald, and they demanded lower tariffs, systematic marketing of their goods, better homestead laws, and local control over large land companies. In short, they wanted an end to the corruption of the Northwest administration. These requests were ignored by the Macdonald government. Although the white farmers and settlers were experiencing serious problems, the Indians and Métis were suffering even greater economic difficulties in the early 1880s. Chiefs complained that many of the great promises made by Ottawa during treaty negotiations had not been kept. Councillor Fine Day of Battleford Reserve stated that most Indians had come into reserves by 1882, but it was very much against their wishes. It was either come in or starve to death. He claimed that his people were trying to make a living by cutting cordwood, but they received so little pay for their wood that it barely kept them from starvation. The government's policy could be summed up in 6 words: feed one day, starve the next. From the Torchwood Hills, the interpreter reported a similar state of starvation. I beg to inform you that the Indians around here are starving very badly. I fear that many of these people will not see spring. Indian Affairs officials apparently felt that once the Indians were placed on reserves, they would become totally conquered people who could be treated as subservient children. Some of the worst Indian Affairs officials were those at Frog Lake. The Hudson's Bay factor there stated they ill-treated these poor people in a most brutal manner. They kicked them, beat them, and cursed them in a most revolting fashion. 2 stood out as particularly miserable beasts. The local minister held a similar opinion of these officials. In numerous instances, the way they treated the natives could not but produce harmful effects. Certain men treated the Indians like dogs. The fort officials also exploited their positions. At the beginning of winter, the government agents halved the Indians' rations and sold the excess for their own profit. The Indians could not complain of the shameful practice because all the government representatives did the same thing, right from the governor of the territories down to the sub-agents on the reserves. By the spring of 1884, the economic conditions of the Indians were so serious the chief poundmaker called an assembly of Indians of the Northwest. He claimed that Indians realized they had made a serious mistake in agreeing to treaties with the federal government. Superintendent Clozier of the Mounted Police attempted to arrest the Indian chiefs for assembling, but they were so desperate that they defied Clozier's authority. The Métis, likewise, were close to starvation, since their means of livelihood had practically disappeared, and in 1878 they began petitioning the federal government for assistance. As Riel had stated, these lands belonged to them once through original title, twice for having defended them at the cost of their blood, and thrice for having cultivated and inhabited them. The Métis had requested assistance in obtaining seed grain and farm implements, but instead, they were asked by the federal government to pay $2 per acre for their own farms which they had improved and developed. Between 1878 and 1884, the Métis submitted 84 petitions to Ottawa requesting better conditions and better services. Not one was answered. According to an Ontario newspaper, the half-breeds of the plains have not been dealt with by the present government. On the contrary, steps were expressly taken in the direction of delay. Not even mounted police requests for assistance to the half-breeds stirred the government. Sergeant Kennan explained the serious economic conditions and the need for government action in a letter to Superintendent Clozier in September 1884. The crops here are almost a total failure, and everything indicates that the half-breeds are going to be in a very straitened conditions before the end of the coming winter, which of course will make them more discontented and will probably drive them to an outbreak, and I believe that trouble is almost certain before the winter passes, unless the government extends some aid to the half-breeds during the coming winter. Such concern was unusual, coming from the mounted police. According to popular explanation, the mounted police was established to prevent whiskey traders from buying Indian furs, which the Hudson's Bay Company claimed as its exclusive right. However, it is not just a coincidence that the mounted police were established during the development of Indian reserves to ensure the success of treaty negotiations with the Indians and help relocate Indians and half-breeds to the reserves and colonies. The mounted police had the responsibility of patrolling the reserves and Métis communities, but proved instead to be a source of oppression and agitation, much disliked by the native people. Councillor Fine Day claimed that the Indians suffered brutality under the Mounties, who frequently paraded through native settlements in order to intimidate the people and remind the natives that they had to stay in their place. When the Hudson's Bay factor at Fort Carleton complained to the Mounties that the half-breeds were becoming lawless and threatening a rebellion, 50 Mounties marched into the Métis community at Batoche and threatened the entire population. They attempted to arrest Gabriel Dumont, chief of the Batoche Half-Breed Council, and at the same time terrorized the people. This display of force successfully intimidated most of the natives, as it was intended to. The Indians who had lived in the area for thousands of years without police saw no reason for the establishment of a force in the Northwest, since there was no serious disorder or lawlessness in the country. To the native people, This military force was similar to the federal troops who had invaded Fort Garry in 1870. The Mounties were not ambassadors of goodwill or uniformed men sent to protect Indians. They were the colonizers' occupational forces, and hence the oppressors of Indians and Métis. The volumes written about how helpful and understanding the Mounties are toward native people are sweetheart myths written by WASPs who have never experienced insults, beatings, and bullets from a Mountie. The attempt to arrest Dumont was particularly resented by the Métis, since the Batoche Half-Breed Council was a representative body elected by the local people of Batoche, St. Laurent, and St. Louis, which they felt should be respected. The council had 15 members, a president, and a constitution. The inhabitants of St. Laurent held a public assembly to draw up laws and regulations for the peace and tranquility of their community, in the absence of any form of government among them to administer justice and to judge the differences that may arise among them. They have thought it necessary to choose from among their number a chiefs and councillors invested with power to judge differences and to decide questions and matters affecting the public interest. The chief with the members of his council is elected for 1 year, and during their terms of power, the president and the members of council are empowered to judge all cases that shall be brought before them. The chief, by the advice of his council, can convoke the general assemblies of the public in order to submit their decision matters of higher consequence, concerning which they would hesitate to pass orders without knowing the opinion of the majority of the public. Since most Métis people were directly involved in the difficult political issues of their community, they had a fairly good understanding of the struggles they encountered in making a living and in dealing with the federal government. A specific issue that had generated considerable anxiety among the Batoche Métis was the land claim of the Prince Albert Colonization Land Company, which was attempting to seize a vast tract of land in St. Louis on which several half-breeds families had settled. The company was composed of cabinet ministers, relatives, and top government officials. The confrontation became serious. The Métis decided to protect the land with guns if necessary. The situation remained largely a standoff until after the half-breeds' defeat at the Battle of Batoche. In the confusion that followed, it is likely that most half-breed families lost their land, as some of the men were sentenced to penitentiary terms. Another source of agitation in the Northwest was Governor Dewdney, a corrupt and arrogant man who encouraged similar attitudes among his subordinates. Besides cheating the Indians of their rations, Dewdney and his government generally held these people in contempt, and were likewise corrupt and dictatorial in their dealings with white people. He neglected his duties as governor, and spent his time dealing in lands, mines, and timber. Although Dewdney had been approached by the people of the Northwest concerning their grievances, he did little to alleviate their suffering. His response was a message to MacDonald, suggesting that more troops should be sent west if the agitation continued. The governor also retained a great deal of personal power over the people within his jurisdiction. Individuals were unable to keep liquor in their homes unless Dewdney personally granted them this privilege, and he reserved the right to revoke these permits at any time if he was dissatisfied with the permit holder's behavior. Because the Northwest Territories Council was subservient to him, Dewdney made himself virtually an absolute ruler in the Northwest. Contrary to the traditional interpretation, Louis Riel was not the main source of agitation in the Northwest struggle of 1885. The Batoche half-breeds had a local government whose council members and president were democratically elected. Under these circumstances, it was not possible for Riel or anyone else to come to Batoche and take over individual control of the people and their government. The decision to invite Riel to Saskatchewan was taken after the matter had been discussed by people in several districts, both native and white. The invitation specified what Riel would have to do, and his main function was to aid the people of the Northwest in their constitutional struggle. He was responsible to the people and therefore took direction from them. That there is anything in Mr. Riel's ability as a leader to cause alarm is not believed by those who have had the opportunity of judging him. His own statements are so pacific in nature that no one could be surprised to hear of his volunteering for missionary work. Riel was working for the Northwest People's Movement, not leading it. He was not in a position to command the forces of confrontation, and he tried to persuade the Métis people to avoid violence and separation from the white people's forces. As William Jackson said in his formal statement to the citizens of Prince Albert, in regard to his public attitude, it is better to accept his services as long as he works for us. As long as both elements work on the square, doing justice to each other, there will be no clash, but a marked advance toward our end, i.e., justice in the Northwest.